Good evening and welcome to another webinar organised by the Palestine Return Centre. Ongoing Nakba at 75, Palestinians demand the right of return. My name's Mick Napier. I'm a founder member of the Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign, and again delighted to be asked to host this really important webinar. Tonight we've got three great guests: Huwaida Araf, Mohammed Ayash and Richard Boyd Barrett. So the format will be that you'll hear each of them for 12 to 15 minutes. I'm under instructions. I would like to give you more, guys, but the forces that be tell me I've got to bring you to a halt after 15 minutes. So after each of our guests has spoken for 12 to 15 minutes, we'll have ample time for Q&A. So again, good evening and welcome. It's an online panel discussion, of course, three distinguished speakers, and the Nakba 75 years on, the continuation, not a historical thing packed away in the past, but a process roaring in the present day. And they'll be talking about that and the importance of international solidarity with the Palestinian people and Palestinian refugees legally enshrined, if morally enshrined in many ways, but legally enshrined right of return to the areas they were driven out of with great violence in 48 and subsequently as well. Huwaida Araf is a Palestinian American human rights attorney and activist. She's the co-founder of the Nobel Peace Prize nominated ISM, the International Solidarity Movement, a Palestinian civil society-led movement that utilizes non-violent direct action to confront and challenge Israeli military occupation and colonial violence. Huwaida is the former chairperson of the Free Gaza movement, and from August to December 2008, led 5 sea voyages to the Gaza Strip to confront and challenge Israel's illegal blockade on the 2 million Palestinians living there. She was one of the primary organizers of the Gaza Freedom Flotilla, and she was traveling with it when it was lethally attacked by Israeli forces on 31st of May 2010. In 2011, Huwaida was also one of 6 Palestinian freedom riders who attempted to ride segregated Israeli buses traveling to Jerusalem, an action for which, shockingly but unsurprisingly, they were beaten and then arrested. Huwaida currently resides with her husband and 2 elementary-aged children in Michigan, where she practices civil rights law. Recently, she was a candidate for the US Congress in Michigan's 10th Congressional District. Our second guest, Mohammed Ayash, is the author of A Hermeneutics of Violence. He was born and raised in Silwan in Jerusalem before immigrating to Canada, where he's now an associate professor of sociology at Mount Royal University. He's currently writing a book on settler colonial sovereignty in Palestine, Israel. Final guest is Richard Boyd Barrett, an Irish member of the Parliament for People Before Profit Solidarity. He's a TD, and I've forgotten how to pronounce the meaning behind TD. I've forgotten also the name, how to pronounce the constituency. Richard, you'll correct me and forgive me later, I hope. And he's been a member of the Irish Dáil since the 2011 general election. Before that, he helped to organise mass protests against the war in Iraq in 2003 as chair for the Irish anti-war movement. Richard has continuously fought for Ireland's Israeli ambassador to be expelled and to place sanctions on Israel for its brutal treatment of Palestinians and its apartheid regime. So we aim to finish at 8:30. Once again, 12-15 minutes each. And I think Mohammed bravely offered to go first. We divided it up, Richard, before you arrived. Are you okay with being in the middle, yeah? Okay, so it's Mohammed, then Richard, and then getting the last word because she's ailing slightly, some kind of surgery, is Huwaida. Mohammed, take it away. You're a Canadian, the Canadian government has admitted genocide against the First Nations of that part of the world, but they don't allow us to. They don't talk about genocide against the Palestinians. Why are we talking about the Nakba tonight, Mohanad?
Yes, thank you so much for the introduction and for that question. And maybe I'll start right there. And thank you for the organizers and of course everyone who's listening in. And just so it happens that Canada is boycotting, one of the countries boycotting the commemoration of the Nakba at the United Nations this year. So that tells you a lot about where Canada stands as part of the American empire and the American imperial bloc, of which Israel is a part. Canada, by the way, has not really recognized its genocide of the indigenous people here either. Just to be clear on that, there may be some statements here and there that suggest that they do acknowledge it or want to do something about it, but it's all a sham. Canada has never actually tried to properly address its settler colonial foundation and its continuing settler colonial violences against indigenous peoples here. And just like it denies the reality of Canadian settler colonialism in its comprehensive true form and its continuation today, it also denies Israeli settler colonial foundations and the continuation of the Israeli settler colonial project in Palestine. So far from standing up for the ideals of human rights and democracy and the rule of law and justice and freedom, as Canada always proclaims itself to do and to be, Canada, in fact, stands in the way of true decolonization, of true liberation and freedom for Indigenous peoples here in Canada and Indigenous peoples in Palestine, the Palestinian people, and elsewhere. So there's little to be admired about Canada's role in the world, as far as I'm concerned. So let's. I want to take my brief time here to talk a little bit about that Nakba and the fact that it's ongoing. And I want to focus more on its ongoing nature because everybody here, I assume, already knows the story, already knows the history. And the story of the Nakba, I want to emphasize, is not the Palestinian version of the story or the Palestinian version of events. The Nakba is the definitive framing of what actually happened in 1948, and in fact, prior to 1948, and what has been happening ever since. It is the framing that gets us as close as possible to the reality of the situation. Everything else obfuscates that reality. So let's cut through all that bull and all the BS that is found all over public discourse, especially mainstream political discourse in places like the UK, like Canada, like the US, France, Germany. You see the trend here. Western Europe and North America, the imperial hegemony of that region is what drives the obfuscation of what happened to the Palestinians and what is still happening to the Palestinians. Zionism as a political ideology and a political project was always settler colonial root and stem, regardless of whether it's liberal Zionism, religious Zionism, left, right wing. It is always first and foremost settler colonial across its variations in ideologies, and Zionists knew that they had to expel the Palestinian people from their lands and homes in order to create the Israeli state. This was not some, unintended consequence or something that they didn't realize would happen. In fact, it took many years of planning and discussions and internal debates that happened within the Zionist movement about how to create Israel by uprooting the Palestinians from their lands and homes. And this does culminate in 1948. Like I said, there was already expulsions of Palestinians from their lands all the way back to the 1920s. But in 1948, it happens on a mass scale, supported, of course, by the British Empire. Without the British Empire, Israel doesn't come into being. So the British Empire played a critical role in this, and you had the expulsion of approximately 750,000 to 800,000 Palestinians from their homes and lands, never to return to them again. That makes up about 55% of the total Palestinian population across the whole region, approximately 80% or even maybe a little bit more from what became Israel. So a large proportion of the Palestinian population was expelled. The majority was expelled during that settler colonial war of conquest in 1948. And Israel, of course, was determined not to let those Palestinians return, because that's the whole Zionist project, is to create a Jewish majority living on a Jewish state, in a Jewish state, in lands that have been expropriated by the Israeli state. So they created all sorts of laws that prohibited those Palestinians from returning to their lands and homes. Those laws are, of course, still in effect today. And not only that, they had their eyes on taking the whole land. You know, even before 1948, Zionist leaders wanted to take the whole land from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, but they couldn't because of Palestinian resistance. That wouldn't allow them to take over the whole land, but they never gave up on that goal. The Zionist movement still is determined to take over the entirety of historic Palestine and create a Jewish state with a Jewish majority on it. So that's why the Nakba is ongoing, because that project just saw itself as achieving its first phase in 1948. It was the kind of the basis from which it would then continue to practice the expulsion of Palestinians and the colonization of Palestine. And of course, you know, that happened through all sorts of policies and structures of violence. Of course, in 1967, there was the 1967 war, where Israel, basically occupied the whole land. And started to practice unofficial sovereignty over the entire piece of land. So since 1967, Israel has been what it has always wanted to be, which is the de facto sovereign over the entire piece of land. Now, of course, they don't want to be officially the sovereign of all of it, because that would then mean that all those Palestinians that they occupied would become part of this sovereign entity called Israel. And that would, ruin their balance. It wouldn't give them a Jewish majority. So ever since then, we've seen all sorts of policies and practices that have tried to slowly remove Palestinians from their lands, basically making life impossible for Palestinians to live on their lands. And that has happened in different ways, depending on which region you're talking about. So if we jump ahead, for example, the besiegement of the Gaza Strip, one of the most brutal sieges in modern history, if not all of history, that has been ongoing since 2007, and we see no end in sight, is a way to basically, delimit Palestinian life within a very small territory. People forget that most of the people that living in the Gaza Strip are refugees from 1948. So there were Palestinians who call other parts of Palestine their homeland and want to return to it, but they're not allowed to do that. They are imprisoned in the Gaza Strip. So the Gaza Strip, which is kind of painted in mainstream media, and certainly by the Israeli forces, as well, Israel has nothing to do with that. In fact, it has everything to do with the continuation of the ongoing Nakba. It is continuously preventing Palestinian refugees from returning to their lands. It is continuously preventing the development of Palestinian social, political, economic systems. It is continuously eliminating any real notion or real practice of Palestinian sovereignty. They determine what goes in and what comes out of the Gaza Strip. They determine where people can go and who can come in and who can't, and who can leave and who can't. And they determine access to resources, access to lands. They determine economics. They determine everything that we associate with the term sovereignty. They determine the quote unquote borders. You hear this all the time. There's clashes on the borders between Israel and the Gaza Strip. Palestinians never agreed that these were their borders. The Gaza Strip should be connected to other parts of Palestine, but Palestinians can't do that because Israel forbids them from doing that. So these are all just parts of the continuation of that ongoing Nakba. And we see it today as well play out in neighborhoods like Sheikh Jarrah and neighborhoods like Silwan, where I'm from. Where I was born and raised, lived there for the first 14 years of my life before we immigrated to Canada in the early 1990s. There's people facing expulsion from their homes, settlers taking over those homes. That is continuously happening in those neighborhoods, in Hebron and many other regions. So that's, the whole core of the issue is that expulsion of Palestinians from their lands in order to create this Jewish state for a Jewish majority. That is the goal of the Zionist project, and that project is ongoing in so many different ways. That the only way to really understand the situation is to think through this framing of the ongoing Nakba. And I'll just stop there and look forward to the discussion afterwards.
Thanks, Mohanad. You've saved a little bit of time from your allocation. That's great. Thanks very much, and given us a lot of food for thought. Second person up is Richard. Richard, you're a member of the Parliament in the Dáil, you've been there for 12 years. How do you avoid corruption and despair and keep on campaigning?
Well, there's a few answers to that, Mike, but one thing that prevents me from sinking into despair, and it was the reason I first got involved in politics at all, long before I ever even stood for an elected position, was the inspiration that was given to me by Palestinians. Because I first became active in politics when I was an 18-year-old. I went to Palestine and stumbled accidentally into the first Palestinian Intifada, and very quickly befriended Palestinians from the West Bank, from Hebron refugee camps in the West Bank. And the family I became very friendly with and stayed with, the first thing they told me was they described how in 1948 they had been, through the violence of Zionist militias, driven from their home, and they were, setting aside any kind of political ideology or anything else. It was clear to me from listening to them that they were absolutely determined that they had the right to return to the place, to the home, to the village from where they were expelled in 1948, and that they would never accept anything less. And that was true of the older members of the family who still remembered the Nakba, and their children and their children's children. And I think that is just an essential truth about the vast, vast majority of Palestinians. And it is why the commemoration of the Nakba is so important, is to remind us, what is the essential cause of the situation that people see on their television screens week in, week out, when, it's often presented as a sort of almost irrational conflict between Palestinians and Israelis, and there's sort of two sides engaged in some sort of conflict with one another for almost inexplicable reasons. And I think commemorating the Nakba is vitally important in remembering that this is not an inexplicable situation, but all of it stems from a crime, a great crime, which was the Nakba and the entire project, Zionist project, of which the Israeli state, if you like, is the manifestation, which is to dispossess all of the Palestinians of their identity, of their nationhood, and all of their land. And that is, if you like, the root of this situation. Not some inexplicable conflict between Palestinians and Jews, but actually a project of settler colonialism, a project of absolutely brutal ethnic cleansing, apartheid, racism, and a sort of genocidal assault on Palestinian identity and existence as a coherent group of people. That is the reality of Palestine, and I think it is vitally important that we remember that. And I suppose the practical implications of that are important in sort of day-to-day advocacy for the Palestinian cause. And if I just give a few examples of stuff that's happening here in Ireland, tomorrow night there will be a debate in the Irish Parliament on a motion put forward by the opposition, one of the leading opposition parties, Sinn Féin, who are a left nationalist party, for want of a better word, the main opposition party. And that is a very, very good motion, a bill, in fact, looking for what's known as the Irish Strategic Investment Fund to disinvest in any investments that are linked to Israeli companies or companies engaged in any way in trade or business or enterprise on the occupied territories. And that's a good thing that such a bill is being proposed. I will certainly be supporting it. It will be very interesting to see what the Irish government says about it. I certainly have no doubt that the vast majority of governments in Europe would oppose such a bill because they don't want to even acknowledge that, that the Israeli state is guilty of any crimes, but continue to give Israel favored trade status. So the fact that such a debate is happening in the Irish Parliament and that there is at least a possibility that that bill might pass is a very, very good thing. Just as it's a very good thing that a bill was passed in the Parliament, although not enacted, and I'll get to that point in a minute, which also proposed the banning of all trade with the occupied territories. Also, there was a motion passed in the last 2 years, essentially acknowledging that the settlements, that have brought 750,000 illegal Israeli settlers onto land that even under international law is designated for the Palestinians, a motion was passed and supported by all parties that what Israel was doing amounted to de facto and illegal annexation of Palestinian land, and therefore, if you like, was illegitimate from the point of view of international law, and should be opposed. Now, those are all very, very good things, and I obviously would have been to the forefront in supporting those kind of motions, as I will tomorrow. But I always have a little bit of a mixed feeling about these bills and motions, because if you take the one tomorrow night, but this is true of almost all of them, there is also an implication that if the settlements in land that was designated for Palestine under the Oslo Agreement were dismantled, if all trade with the illegal settlements was stopped, that then would be okay, that we might have the basis of a resolution of the conflict. In other words, there is illegal and illegitimate Israeli settlements and policies of ethnic cleansing, but there is also somehow a legitimate Zionist enterprise which has a right to exist and has a right to, as we often hear the phrase, look after its security interests. And we hear all those justifications for, whether it's the recent attacks on Gaza or, various other atrocities committed by Israel, that there is a sort of legitimate Zionist project, which, is acceptable. Now, to me, the Nakba, and remembering it and remembering that it is ongoing and that it is a project of ethnic cleansing and of a project aimed at completely destroying Palestinian identity and seizing all of the land of Palestine, and indeed the connected question of the millions of Palestinian refugees who've been displaced, exiled from their home and are not allowed to return. That reminds us that actually there is no legitimate Zionist project. There isn't a bit that's legitimate and a bit that's illegitimate. that the entire project from the beginning was a project of ethnic cleansing, was a project aimed at destroying the Palestinian people as a coherent national group and completely displacing them. And I think that is critically important for us to remember, because this is not, if you like, even for those who are sympathetic to the Palestinian cause or who voice rhetorically sympathy with the plight of Palestinians, they still hold to the view that somehow the partition of Palestine was a legitimate act, and that there is some two-state solution where there is a potential to have the Zionist state peacefully coexist with the Palestinians and somehow have Palestinian rights vindicated. Well, if we remember the Nakba, if we remember the millions of Palestinians who remain stateless all over the world and who are denied the right to return, we realize that actually that's not true. That the entire project of Zionism is incompatible with vindicating the most basic and fundamental rights of the Palestinian people, the right to self-determination, and crucially, the right to return. That they have the right to return to the homes and villages from which they were violently, in the most brutal fashion, expelled, and that project of what we see when we see violence and conflict, whether it's in Gaza or Jerusalem or anywhere in historic Palestine, that it is actually the result of the ongoing Nakba that is written into, hardwired into the DNA of the Zionist project. That there is simply no disentangling the existence of the Zionist project with the campaign of ethnic cleansing and the theft of Palestinian identity and land and so on. That these two things go absolutely together, and that we have to completely delegitimize the entire Zionist project. And key to, if you like, explaining that is remembering the Nakba, explaining what's going on now as precisely an ongoing Nakba, and insisting on the right to return as an absolute right that cannot be negotiated away. And I'll finish with that. Just a brief allusion again to Ireland. There was some notion when Ireland was partitioned that it was a legitimate effort to resolve some sort of intractable religious conflict between those in Ireland who had a desire for national self-determination, for an Irish Republic, and those who were loyal to Britain, and that somehow that partition could be done in a way that would resolve the conflict. But of course, the whole of Irish history proves that not to be the case. That the settler colonial project, which was the partition of Ireland, was precisely about a colonial and imperial enterprise to divide and rule and control Irish territory. And as long as that partition remains, the conflict in Ireland remains. Not at quite the level it has been in the past, but it continues to fester because at the heart of it, there was a colonial settler project, which was about dividing in order to control territory from a colonial and imperial perspective. And what's true in Ireland is doubly true in Palestine, and we have to use every opportunity to remind people of that fundamental fact. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Richard. You've also been within your time, and that leaves enough time for Huwaida Arif. Huwaida, you come with quite a CV. You're involved in direct action as well as legal strategies. Ukraine has been able to get to the International Court of Justice in a year after the Russian invasion. Palestinians have still not been able to get there. It ain't a level playing field, is it?
No, it isn't. And let me say good evening or good day wherever you are to all listeners. And thank you for having me. It's actually bittersweet to be with you today, as we know this day and evening marks the 75th anniversary of the Palestinian Nakba. I'd rather be with you on a happier occasion, but it is important, as we've heard, to mark these anniversaries and to continue teaching in order to advance and in order to see the day when the Nakba can end, inshallah, as we say in Arabic. And I want to get to your point about the ICC, the International Criminal Court. But before that, I just wanted to reflect a little bit on where we've come across 75 years of resistance, and Palestinians are still holding steadfast, of course. And we activists, sometimes we have highs and lows, as in any movement, we have highs and lows and we have wins and losses. But it's important to see and to recognize that all the work that we are doing is advancing the day when Palestinians will see justice. When I was involved in direct action, it was over 20 years ago now when I started. I first moved back to Palestine because my parents came to the United States when my mom was pregnant with me. So I was born in the United States. I moved back to Palestine in 2000, and I ended up co-founding the International Solidarity Movement, and we were engaged in a lot of direct action against what the Israeli military was doing. And part of our work was also to really try to get across a message to the mainstream media, to the people, because it was so distorted, the image that was being reflected of what's happening on the ground, what the Palestinian struggle was about. We had to fight with journalists to not call settlements, Israeli settlements, not call them neighborhoods. You know, we had to hang big banners to say, it's the occupation, stupid. It's not here where you have a just kind of a conflict with two equal sides over land, and then you're blaming kind of the Palestinians for their shortcomings without recognizing that this is a violent occupation that is part of a larger settler colonial project. And we've come, I think, quite a ways since then, where we don't necessarily see settlements in the mainstream media being called neighborhoods anymore. At least I'm not, and some journalists will actually do their job and call them illegal settlements. And that's the result of a lot of work that's being done on the ground and by activists, by Palestinians, to educate journalists. That's the result of social media, where a lot of people are also active in getting information out, and about a lot of us joining the profession also of journalism and having integrity when it comes to that, and continuing to build alliances, which the Palestinian movement and the Palestinian Liberation Organization actually had a long history of, but it was stifled in this era that we call the Oslo peace process era, recognizing, as we all do, that the Oslo peace process is dead, and continuing to resist for total liberation has reinvigorated a lot of us, and has made clear the importance of, as has also been clear, in not giving into where the politicians, and the governments want us to, just coming to a negotiating table as if, again, that this was any kind of dispute amongst equals, as opposed to having a very violent settler colonial project that needs to be dismantled. And so you build your alliances, and you strengthen yourself, and you continue to resist, not instead of speaking, of course, in any way, but the resistance has to continue. The resistance and holding strong to the fact that Palestinians have rights that have been stripped away from them. And anything short of a total realization of those rights is not good enough, because everybody has the right to live in freedom, peace, and security, and nobody's rights should be contingent upon what makes someone else comfortable or uncomfortable, or somebody else's expansionist views and sense of entitlement to something that is not theirs. So, sorry, that was just a little bit of background, because sometimes I myself also get a little bit of, frustrated, particularly living in the United States and what we are dealing with. But it's important to recognize that we have come a long way, and we are continuing to build, and we have had and will continue to have victories because because our cause is just. Our cause is not calling for the annihilation of any other people. Our cause is not calling for doing injustice against any other people. Our cause is for freedom, liberation, equality, restitution, a future where all people can live free. And that is a cause that will eventually prevail. Now, to your question and to what I had wanted to talk about, which is the landscape in the United States when it comes to Palestinian rights. And I touch on that when getting also to your question about the ICC, the International Criminal Court. Yes, we have first a complete kind of hypocrisy, which I'm going to put aside for now, of the kind of slow and selective investigations of the court when it comes to certain situations like Palestine, which lodged a complaint in 2015 with the International Criminal Court, or when it comes to Afghanistan, and then what we see happening with Ukraine and Russia. In less than a year, they're able to get to the court. And specifically, I want to point to the United States and their position on this, because the United States was one of dozens of countries that pledged support for the ICC's investigation of war crimes committed by Russian forces. And the United States Congress voted last December to loosen legislation that would restrict support for the court, because historically the United States has been hostile really to the court. But they loosened restrictions so that the United States US officials can share evidence with ICC prosecutors. Now, compare that to what they've been saying about Palestine and Palestinians receiving justice at the court. One of their the United States' main arguments has been that, well, Israel is not a party to the Rome Statute and shouldn't be held accountable. The ICC has no jurisdiction over Israel, and Palestine shouldn't be a party, is the United States' position. Well, Ukraine and Russia aren't parties to the ICC either, and still the United States is very supportive of moving ahead with that one. So there is a hypocrisy when it comes to United States positions. We know that for sure, but even when it comes to using the law, unfortunately, because even the ICC is not immune to a lot of the politicking that goes on behind the scenes. And when it comes to the funding of these institutions that are supposed to be impartial and that are supposed to see that there is justice that is done. So we do have an issue there. We have, I'm going to take it back to, again, the United States and where they are vis-a-vis Palestine and its ongoing hypocrisy. We have the situation of the journalist Shireen Abu Akleh. We marked the 1-year anniversary of her death, and she was, as we know, a Palestinian American journalist. So she had American citizenship. And over the last few weeks, we have seen just shameful kind of not even pandering, but almost an attempt to erase her existence by US officials. For example, the US Security Coordinator for Israel and the Palestinian Authority a few weeks ago sent the State Department an updated summary about her killing. And on May 1st, a US Senator from Maryland requested that the administration release this report to Congress. And what did the State Department say? They said that before they can release it to Congress, the administration needs to make some changes to the content of its report, which also begs the question about how much the US is interfering in the information that's being gathered, in the information that's coming out. There was an FBI investigation that was open, but the United States, the administration will barely acknowledge it. They won't give any information about it. And again, knowing the history of the United States, and specifically with this administration, the Biden administration, there are certain fears that the administration is going to interfere to ensure that justice is not done for Shireen Abu Akleh. And if justice is not done for Shireen Abu Akleh, who's probably one of the most prominent journalists of her time, and being an American citizen, then in the words of journalist Sharif Abdul Quddus the other day. He said, if Shireen Abu Akleh can't get justice, what hope does any other Palestinian have? I mentioned that over the last few weeks, the administration has almost been trying to erase Shireen. President Biden and Secretary of State Blinken, they have just left Shireen out when they have made, over the past couple of weeks, very powerful statements defending press freedom and protection of journalists. Specifically, like on April 29th, President Biden spoke at the White House Correspondents Association dinner about journalist safety. Didn't mention Shireen. A few days later, there was a World Press Freedom Day event organized by the Washington Post, and Secretary Blinken ignored a specific question about Shireen and didn't mention her at all, despite addressing attacks on other American journalists. So again, they are coming to protect Israel at the expense of justice. Forget for Palestinians, justice for an American citizen. And the one of the most important jobs of an administration, of a government, many countries, is ensuring the safety and well-being of their citizens. And we see what the American administration is doing. And another point that I wanted to mention when it comes to the landscape here, and specifically, I've been pointing to, this administration. I've been pointing to this administration because it's difficult for a lot of us activists here, who we all know how terrible President Trump was, not only for American citizens, but for Palestinians and for really the world when it came to some of his policies. But when we see this administration, which has been better on a lot of issues that help average Americans, and has been better on some global issues, of course. But when it comes to Palestine specifically, the hypocrisy makes it very difficult for us, especially when we're talking about the next election coming up, and what people who believe in freedom and justice for all people and the kind of policies that uplift Americans here, all people struggling, and Palestinians for sure, when the Biden administration is so bad on Palestine. When the administration was transitioning, I was part of a team of lawyers from the National Lawyers Guild who put together a legal memo advising the administration on Trump area policies that needed to be rescinded because they violate international law and they violate even US precedent. It was completely ignored, and as we see, this administration has not in any way reversed any of Trump's policies, except for maybe the funding of UNRWA. But other than that, rescinding the recognition of Jerusalem and the Golan Heights as Israeli territory, moving the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, reopening the PLO office, and a lot of other Trump area policies have not been reversed by this administration because it is one of the most Zionist pro-Israel administrations that we have had to date. And again, that makes it difficult for us activists and pursuers of peace and justice that don't want to see someone like Trump come back. But again, the hypocrisy makes it difficult to actually get behind this administration when we're talking about elections.
Lady, you've got 2 minutes.
Oh, sorry, gosh, time goes by quickly. Having said that, let me just say the work that we continue to do here, I think, is powerful. We continue to speak up, and we are attacked, of course. I just a couple of months ago was slammed, all over the local media because a local high school invited me to speak, and because I spoke about Palestinian struggle for justice, I was labeled anti-Semitic. Of course, that happens all over the place, but we were able to come together with a lot of allies and decry this attempt to silence Palestinians. And I think we need to stick together to continue doing that. We saw just a few days ago on the congressional level, Speaker of the House McCarthy tried to shut down Representative Rashida Tlaib in having an event to commemorate the Nakba, again, trying to silence Palestinians. But the more we speak out about it, the more we are not silenced about it, not letting them shut us down. I think the stronger we grow. And I know that's might be easier said than done, but for anyone out there that feels attacked, that feels that they need support in the activism they're doing, it's there. And I think that we just need to remember that it's never been easy to be on the right side of history, right? When has resisting colonialism, racism, segregation, oppression ever been easy? Throughout history, I think those who have taken a moral stance have suffered, but in the end, history has vindicated them. And I think the same way here, history will vindicate us. We are the politicians continue to try to silence the people and not do our will. But as I have said for years, when the people lead, the leaders will follow. And so may we continue lead with our heads held high and our voices strong. Thank you.
Thank you, Huwaida. Great. So there's three speakers, three succinct, sharp analyses. If you've got any questions, viewers, drop them into the chat box and they'll be conveyed to me and I'll read them out. I've got a couple of questions, if I may. There seems to be a consensus that the problem is not there was an Israeli fall from grace in '67. Zionism is an inherently colonizing and violent ideology. So how can it be defeated? I mean, the Vietnamese won. They were the militarily weaker side. And Algeria got independence against the French. They were the militarily far, far weaker side. In anti-colonial struggles, it's not the killers who can do the most killing who win. It's people who can absorb terrible punishment and continue to struggle. That would seem to be the Palestinians. Don't you think, Mohammed? Then Richard, then Huwaida, your comments.
So, look, so there are always, of course, similarities and differences across different struggles. I think for me, the path forward that I see is one of pressure on the Israeli state. Israel will never change course, not on its own. There's no, and not only do they have no reason to change, they're encouraged to keep doing what they're doing. And I just want to emphasize that point. The U.S. Is not some kind of neutral, observer of this that is being, fooled by the Zionist lobby to do this and that. That's far from reality. The U.S. knows exactly what's happening. It fully supports it. It fully makes it possible. As Joe Biden said in his speech in Congress in the 1980s, if Israel didn't exist, we'd have to invent it. As Adam, the Palestinian scholar Adam Haniyeh said, citing another work here, and I quote, "One former U.S. intelligence officer has been quoted as claiming that the U.S.-Israel military relationship was worth 5 CIAs. And that an upkeep of an armed force equivalent to Israel's in the Middle East would cost U.S. taxpayers $125 billion. In other words, they see their aid to Israel as a good deal. That it's a lot cheaper than them creating that kind of a military base in the region, and that base allows them to achieve their imperial interests in the region. So I bring this up because we do have to understand the immense structure of power that we're up against. And I don't see a path of liberation forward through armed resistance. I see it as happening through people power and international pressure that would come from people power to boycott and isolate Israel. That's the only way that Israel will be forced to change course. And what that eventually looks like is de-Zionization as well. I want to make that point clear. Zionism itself cannot ever lead to peace and justice in this region, because Zionism, as we've discussed, is inherently settler colonial. So Israeli Jews will have to de-Zionize and reimagine what their place in that land looks like. And as Huwaida mentioned, we're not, Palestinian liberation does not operate in a zero-sum game like Zionism does. Zionism is a zero-sum political ideology. It says either us or them. Palestinian liberation does not replicate that zero-sum game. And we can, in fact, reimagine how all the people there can live together under new social and political systems that would be decolonized and that would advance liberation and justice for the majority of the people. But that can only come with people power. We're a people power movement. We've got no economic aid to give you. We've got no technology to sell you, no weapons to sell you. We got no diplomatic power. But what we do have is a story of justice that speaks to everybody. And a story of justice that many people around the world can relate to. And I do think that many people around the world see their struggles in their own context for justice and peace and liberation as tied to the Palestinian one. So we do need to continue to generate that people power and put pressure on governments the world over to then put pressure on Israel. And that will be the first step towards de-Zionization and proper decolonial liberation. But it's a long road ahead. But we're staying on it. We haven't gone away for over 100 years. We're not going away ever. So make that clear.
Thanks, Muhannad. Now, I wasn't trying to recommend from the comfort of my armchair armed struggle against the regional superpower. I was merely trying to say that the military superpowers don't always win. That was all. Richard, how can Zionism be defeated? How can Palestinians achieve liberation?
Well, first of all, I just want to agree very strongly with Muhannad, what he said. I mean, we were 800 years trying to decolonize Ireland, and it's still not over yet. But we've made some progress. And I mean, I probably said this at previous meetings before, but I to be honest, I think anybody who wants to, and there's no perfect analogy between any one situation and another, but there is a remarkable parallel between the Irish struggle for self-determination and against colonialism and the Palestinian one, and it's something that is instinctively understood by the majority of people in Ireland, and I think there's a pretty wide recognition in Palestine as well about that parallel, and indeed even to the point that, you know, famously Sir Ronald Storrs, the Governor General of Jerusalem in 1936, when asked about their support for the Zionist project and what it was, he said in a very, very telling acknowledgement that our aim is to create a loyal little Jewish Ulster in the Middle East to guard against a potentially hostile sea of Arabism. So they very consciously modeled the partition of Ireland, the colonial settler project that divided Catholic against Protestant, as a way of controlling the entire population and controlling the entire of Ireland, that they exported that project and that model with very consciously in their minds, and even a lot of the key personnel that played a role in trying to suppress the Irish Revolution in the Irish Revolutionary period went directly from Ireland to Palestine and sought to export that model. So, but there's hope in the Irish story, because despite, you know, many false starts in terms of revolutionary resistance and people power resistance, liberation has moved forward. It's not over yet, but it has moved forward. And but I also think that point, I mean, even what we're doing, very importantly, what we're doing tonight, and what Huwaida and Muhannad have said is terribly important, because I think one of our key jobs is the delegitimization of the Zionist project. And we have to be imaginative in how we do that at every possible hand's turn. And for example, you know, Joe Biden came to Dublin recently, a state visit, and there was, I mean, to be honest, it was nauseating, the way in which the Irish political establishment sought to sort of celebrate his visit. And of course, it's made all the more difficult because he's not Donald Trump, and there was general revulsion against Donald Trump and everything he stood for, rightly and correctly. But therefore, anybody who wasn't Donald Trump had to be an improvement, was the sort of narrative. And Biden was trumpeting his Irish connections. But we had to spoil the party, and it was difficult. So there was a very special sitting of the Irish Parliament, and we boycotted it. We were the only group in the Parliament that did. We got a lot of attacks on us from all sides for boycotting his attendance at the Parliament, but we boycotted it very specifically on the basis of what he had said, what Mohanad has said. We put out those quotes of where Biden said, outrageously, but in a way, in a great admission of what their real agenda is, where he said, if there wasn't an Israel, if an Israel didn't exist, we'd have to create it, and we'd have to station tens of thousands of US troops in the Middle East to control it. In that incredibly frank acknowledgement of the imperialist agenda and why they support the Zionist project, getting that out there was very important, because people, I was on national television for the whole weekend, as were our small number of MPs, saying, why are you boycotting Biden? Why are you saying these things? He's a lovely guy. He's not Donald Trump. But when you actually put it out there, people were quite shocked and going, okay, we didn't realize, because the majority of people in Ireland, as I said, are sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, and they were quite horrified that somebody who was presented as a much more progressive figure actually turns out to be somebody who's one of the most horrible supporters of the entire Zionist project. And that put big question marks in people's heads. And it definitely spoiled the party for the Irish political establishment in a good way. And we did similar things when Ursula von der Leyen came to the Irish Parliament, where, again, it was a sickening exercise in backslapping, where most of the Irish political establishment were saying how wonderful she was, how wonderful the EU was. And we had to get up and say, well, I'm sorry, actually, you went, this woman, we pointed directly, you went to Israel. You did not say a word about what's being done to the Palestinians. You've done arms deals with the Saudi regime. And again, if you find the platform to get this stuff across, people go, really? Okay, that's shocking. And immediately it generates a debate, and immediately new layers, and I'm seeing this all the time, of young people who really believe in principles like equality, who really believe in things like justice, but they don't know because they're hearing this distorted, partial, dishonest narrative. But when they hear some of these facts, they go, okay, there's something really wrong here. Or the double standards with Ukraine. Oh, we're against illegal invasions and occupations in Ukraine, but we're not against them. They have to go out the Palestinians. So I think all of these things are part of an ongoing, and I think advancing project of delegitimization of the Zionist project. I mean, that's not the full answer, because ultimately we do need actual actions that help dismantle the state. I agree with Monahan. I don't think it's about military resistance, but I do think it's about things that can actually bring the Zionist project to its knees, both at the ideological level, but also at the practical level of boycott, divestment, and sanctions.
Hawaida, I believe the biggest port on the American Pacific, Auckland, has refused to unload any Israeli ships since 2014. Astonishing example of where BDS can take us. How can Zionism be defeated, and what's the role of international solidarity in that?
Yeah, I think I would just add, Mohanad and Richard, I think brilliantly summarized where we are and where we need to go, and that we need to continue. It seems like, it's been 75 years and Israel still seems strong and has the support of world leaders and whatnot. But I also believe that it is people power and changing the perspective of and the information that average citizens are getting so that they can exert that power on their governments to change course. I mean, we've had decades of Israel on the international scene being portrayed as the victim. Only recently has that begun to change, and we see the effects of that. I mean, in the United States, I don't know if your listeners have seen, but just a poll done last month showed for the first time ever, at least amongst Democrats, Palestinians have Democrats sympathize with Palestinians more than Israel by 11 points. It's an 11-point margin, 49% to 38%. Now, overall, Israel slightly leads, and obviously amongst the Republican Party, Israel still leads. But again, it used to be that Israel was such a bipartisan issue here, and everybody agreed, and that is changing. The grassroots, the base of the Democratic Party is changing and changing fast. Unfortunately, very few of the politicians are following the wishes and the public opinion polls where it's coming, but they are. It is increasing, the number, and it's increasing because of the work that's done obviously on the streets, but you have to do it, I think, at all levels. So mobilizing, for example, to elect people to office that represent our values on Palestine and on a number of social issues. And when people, activists, mobilize to do that, what they do is decrease dependence of those politicians on lobbies like AIPAC and others that dump millions of dollars into political campaigns to get politicians to do what they want. When we're looking at where we are and what we've been able to accomplish, we have to keep in mind that we are still up against a very organized community of lobbyists that have millions and billions of dollars, and they use it on not only in our elections, but in the media and public relations campaign to distort what is really happening. And what we see now, I would argue, is a very strong pushback by activists who don't have those financial resources, but are still doing a tremendous job based on passion and tenacity and the connections with that they've made with Palestine and with the desire to see liberation. So it has been decades too long, and every day people continue to suffer and continue to die. But there is, I don't see another way except to keep on. If we look at apartheid South Africa, that also didn't come along quickly. The BDS, or the anti-apartheid, like the divestment movement, took a long time to catch on. The United States was one of the last countries in the world to divest and change its tune. But eventually, because of the pressure amongst civil society on college campuses and otherwise in the United States also changed its tune. And we do need, unfortunately, the United States to change its tune, because it continues to block enforcement or any kind of movement in the UN on holding Israel accountable. It continues to send billions of dollars of tax dollars to the Israeli military. So the United States really supports and enables Israel's aggression. So while work all around the world is important, and especially when it's done in Europe, because Americans also look at, when they see also the Europeans in the streets and the European public opinion polls, that affects people here too. So that is all important. But coming back to just the centrality of the United States in enabling Israel's aggression, a lot of work does fall on us here.
We've got some questions here. Corbyn was crushed as a pro-Palestinian candidate to be Prime Minister. Roger Waters was barred, was it by Frankfurt and German cities, from performing because he was a rabid anti-Semite. We've seen people fired from their jobs here in Britain, and even attacks on cultural figures. How do we deal with smears? We have a case based on freedom, liberation, against imperial domination, but we are inevitably libeled as Jew haters. Mohamed and Richard, and then Huwaida again, please.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very excellent question. So, and I think Huwaida and Richard have both brought this up already, but because the pro-Israel, pro-Zionist forces don't have any substantive arguments to make, and they lost that substantive argument on facts, on logic, on validity, on morality, they have just gone out with a brutal, attack mode against any voice that speaks up for Palestinian rights and liberation. Whether that's someone who almost became prime minister in the UK, or a major cultural figure, or someone whose name we don't know about, or someone giving a talk at a school. It's at all levels that there is a concerted effort to invalidate, censor, intimidate, harass all voices speaking up for Palestinian rights. So the question is what do you do against that? So I think the answer has to be contextual. It depends. For someone who is experiencing that kind of censorship as they're running for office, I think the response is who I mentioned, like to mobilize support and to go door to door and knock on people's door and say, no, this is BS. These are baseless allegations and accusations, and you need to still vote for this person. And in fact, I would encourage people to start saying this because it is true. If a politician stands up for Palestine, most likely they're going to be good on other issues as well, social issues. If they don't stand up on Palestine, then I don't trust them with healthcare, education, forget foreign policy. Like there's no I trust them on. So I think we should start to make that clear that that's a good litmus test for how honest the politician is going to be. So in that case, it would work that way. In academia, use academic freedom. Academic freedom is not necessarily like a liberal wishy-washy idea. It works. It protects people. It's supposed to, academic freedom is supposed to protect exactly people like Palestinians and anti-Zionist scholars, many of whom are Jewish as well, who speak up for Palestine. So I guess it just depends on the context on how you oppose that. And sometimes you need lawyers. So I'll leave Huwaida to speak to that more. But there are Palestine legal centers everywhere. There's one in the US. I believe there's one in Europe. I don't know if it's based in the UK or not. There's one that just formed in Canada. Use those resources when appropriate. I'm not the expert on that, so I'll let Huwaida maybe perhaps talk to a little bit more to that.
So, Richard, is Palestine the canary in the mine? Is that a good litmus test? And
without a shadow of a doubt, I think that's spot on. I would say that we should also think about that in reverse order in terms of the bigger question of how do we liberate Palestine, because it is also that the answer to that question is also deeply linked to the transformation of the world system that underpins and supports the Zionist project. I mean, without the United States, without Britain, without indeed the European Union's continued support for Israel, its ability to sustain its project, was more than questionable. I don't think it could sustain its project for very long without that support. So I think that also means we need to think about how we link solidarity with Palestine to that bigger issue of social and political transformation of the world. And it's also just how at a very practical level you can interest people in the Palestinian issue, for people who don't maybe know about it, if you're also the people who are fighting for housing rights for all, for a decent health care, for a better environment. I think the more we do that, and the more those involved in the Palestinian struggle are part of that more general struggle for a progressive transformation of the world we live in, the more that will open new layers of people to an interest in Palestine. And, of course, the reason behind Western support for the Zionist project is deeply interlinked with the horrible logic of the global economic and political system, because, of course, it's so closely linked to that unbelievably ruthless drive to control a commodity, oil, and a region that they consider strategically important, and that is the same logic that leads people to being homeless. It's where the profits of big property investors are more important than the lives of the rights of people to have a roof over their head, you know, and I think you can make those links, and we have to be constantly making the links. The other thing I just say is, I think when accused with anti-Semitism, we must be completely unapologetic in responding very, very forcefully, not in any way defensive, and really being quite outraged, because it is an outrageous suggestion. I mean, supporting the Palestinians is precisely about opposing racism. It's precisely about that. And so for those who support the racist project that is Zionism, to accuse those of us who oppose the Zionist project of being racist again is just so Orwellian, it's untrue. And I think we have to be, and you know, when that allegation was thrown at Jeremy Corbyn, it was shocking, because of course there was very few politicians in British politics who had a better record of opposition to every form of racism, including anti-Semitism. It was an absolutely Orwellian accusation. And the tragedy is that some of the left capitulated to it, or worse, colluded with that narrative out of a very, very cynical agenda to weaken a growing left within the British Labour Party. I mean, I'm glad to say in Ireland, it's not so difficult to win this argument. There have been attempts to get that argument going, but it has very little traction because of our own colonial history. There's a strong awareness of the racism that lies behind the Zionist project being very similar to the racism that was used to justify the colonial oppression of the Irish. So it's a little bit easier for us, but even here, we mustn't be complacent, because there have been attempts to get that narrative going. But I think we have to fire it right back in the other direction. But also, I'm sure I don't have to tell anybody here this, but it is terribly important that we are simultaneously the people who say, yes, the Holocaust against the Jewish people was one of the greatest crimes ever committed against any group in human history. And we shouldn't feel that we need to, I'm not saying many people do, or anybody here would do that, but I think we should be absolutely clear in saying, yes, what was done to the Jewish people by the Nazis was absolutely horrific, but it makes all the more terrible the fact that Zionism can then deploy a sort of horrible racism against the Palestinian people, given what happened to the Jewish people in the Holocaust. And we have to remember the Holocaust was a terrible thing, and we are the people who oppose all forms of racism.
Thanks, Richard. Huwaida, your comments. You're in the States, you're a Palestinian, you hear this disgusting garbage all the time. How do you deal with it?
Yeah, that's true. And in fact, I was just commenting with a friend the other day, it seemed years back, maybe Zionists were more willing to debate us. But as Mohanad said, I think they've lost the debate on all kinds of levels. And now they're interested in just silencing us by throwing out these bogus accusations of anti-Semitism. And I mean, I think it's important to note that Roger Waters challenged the cancellation of his concert, and he won. And there are legal avenues that can be taken. There were a few cases, just one also in the United States by there were attacks on Arab or Palestinian professors in the United States, accusing them of being anti-Semitic. And after investigations were done, they were kind of vindicated, and that there was no kind of anti-Semitism. But that doesn't mean that the Zionists are going to stop, because they don't have another avenue in order to maintain their racist colonial project. They need to keep people thinking a certain way, and so they need to stop us that are speaking truth from trying to speak. I mean, in my own case, I was, just a couple months ago at a high school invited to speak about my experience with racism and discrimination. I was one of 5 speakers, only spoke for a few minutes about growing up Palestinian in the United States. And then I spoke about going to Palestine and starting the International Solidarity Movement. And one thing I stressed was that with the ISM, we invited people from all countries, all races, religions, ethnicities to come stand together, because the Palestinian struggle for liberation is not one against Jews. This is not Palestinians versus Jews or Muslims and Christians versus Jews. It is one of freedom versus occupation and colonialism. And in that respect, if you are on the side of freedom, you can come stand with the Palestinians in their struggle. And I stressed that many people who responded to our call have been Jewish, from Jewish Israelis, Europeans, Jewish Americans. They have been some of our greatest allies. And even stressing that and leaving kids with a message that, try to see past your identity and any attempts to divide us based on identity, and remember that we all deserve the same kind of respect and human rights. That was my message to them. And after that event at the school, this district erupted in calls for administrators to the school to be fired for allowing me to speak to students, and I made their students uncomfortable and all of these things. It was important for us to fight back. And how did we fight back? One of our biggest allies here in Michigan was Jewish Voice for Peace, Detroit, put forth a very strong statement that has been signed by over 200 organizations and 1,000 others, including rabbis and pastors and others, saying, these are bogus claims of anti-Semitism, and that speaking about Palestinian rights is not anti-Semitic, and quite the opposite. We need to all stand together so Palestinians can realize their freedom. So I was able to not back down, because in my years of advocacy, I've become used to these horrific attacks. And luckily I was able to kind of mobilize support to put forward a response to highlight the Zionist tactic. What happened in that school district is 2 administrators did lose their jobs, and others are under continuous pressure, but we're continuing to work with the school in order to expose this tactic for what it is. And it's really a silencing of the Palestinian narrative, the voice, and anyone that dares to speak up, in order to create this chilling effect. Because you see these high-level administrators now lost their jobs because because they didn't drag a Palestinian American off the stage for talking a few minutes about her experience. That is outrageous, and we need to expose that. And in exposing that, I was hoping that we'd provide support to others around the country who are maybe less accustomed to dealing with this vitriol and attacks when it comes as it did, and that people can feel more empowered to speak up and to know that there are avenues, there is support, legal and otherwise. So yes, we deal with it. A long way of saying yes, we deal with it, but it's important not to let them win. They don't have the arguments, or they're just trying to silence us. And as Richard and Mohammed said, I mean, ours is a struggle for, the rights that we are fighting for are rights that everybody should have. That is the Palestinian struggle for rights, not based on, what your background is, what your religion is, what your ethnicity is. It is one that all people can live with freedom and dignity. And that is one that will win, one that is trying to be shut down, but that one that I think will eventually prevail.
In that spirit, can I just ask you, each of you again, to make concluding remarks? We got 10 minutes, so if you have 2 or 3 minutes each, we'll have time for a couple of announcements. But where does each of you individually find grounds for optimism? The Greeks said, whom the gods would destroy, they first drive mad. Ben-Gvir and Smotrich are an example of such madness, certainly genocidal madness. What are your grounds for optimism? Let's take you again, Mohammed.
Sure, thanks. And just very quickly on the back heels of our discussions, I'm the chair of the Calgary Peace Prize. If the administrator is able to put that link on thank you very much. The calgarypeaceprize.ca. Please go to that webpage and sign up for our virtual event that is happening this week, Thursday. We're going to honor Mohammed al-Kurd for his outstanding work for Palestinian freedom, for speaking truth to power. And we're going to have a wonderful panel with fantastic speakers, Ronaldo Walcott, Desmond Cole, Erica Violet Lee, Yara Hawari. We're going to talk about the intersection of Palestinian, Black, and Indigenous struggles, the role of art in the struggle for peace, the ongoing Nakba, and many more other topics. And Zionist groups here in Canada have been continuing to try very hard to cancel this event, but I'm the chair, so we're going ahead. So please sign up. It will be 7 p.m. Palestine time, so I'm not sure what that is in the UK, but it should be a reasonable time in the UK for folks.
7 p.m. will be 5 p.m. in the UK, I think. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, and if you register online, I'm sure the Zoom thing will give you the time and your location. So please sign up. And so source of inspiration, source for hope. It's always the Palestinian people. I always urge people to remember that wherever you see international pressure come on Israel, whenever you see something like the United Nations General Assembly passing a resolution to commemorate the Nakba today, the source of that is the Palestinian people on the streets. It always, all the resistance to Israeli settler colonialism and Zionist racism are Palestinians on the streets who have refused to be erased, who have refused to disappear into the dustbin of history. Look, as Palestinians, we're well aware of our losses. We're well aware that things have gotten worse, not better, and continue to get worse on a daily basis. But we are also aware that against all the odds, we're still here. We could have disappeared, going up against a structure of violence that is as big and powerful as an American imperialism-backed Israeli superpower, regional superpower. As big of a structure that is, we're still here. We're still refusing to be silenced. We're still refusing to be erased. We still maintain our connection to the land, crucially. We've never given that up. Palestinians today are still demanding the right to return to their land, something that the United Nations General Assembly has already said it's an inalienable right of those Palestinians to return to their lands and homes, that we have always known that is our inalienable rights. But never forget that it's always Palestinians on the streets who are revealing the reality of the Zionist project as a violent settler colonial project that practices apartheid, who are revealing also an alternative way of living, an alternative future, what decolonial liberation means, the aspirations that we see Palestinians express on a daily basis. That's where we get our hope. That's where we get our drive to continue. Because regardless of what names they've called me, and I'm on Canary Mission and all the rest of it, and all, my employer gets complaints about me all the time and all the rest of it, nothing compares to what I lived over there and what Palestinians who are living there today are experiencing much more than even I did when I was growing up in the 80s and early 90s. So that's what keeps us going, and solidarity as well is a key aspect of it. When I talk, when I visited England, and the sense of warmth and welcome and hospitality that I received from ordinary Irish people, when I talk to Black communities, Indigenous communities, Arab communities, and they show their solidarity, like that also is a source of inspiration for us to keep going, because we know we're not alone. And that our message does reach to people, and that we feel this sense of real interconnection with people. So that's what keeps me going.
Thank you, Mohammed. Richard, where's the optimism? The lights are going out across Europe. Wars and wars and wars. How do we move forward?
Well, I have to agree with Mohammed, to be honest. And I said it in my introduction that the reason I'm involved in politics was meeting young Palestinians in 1987 who were living in refugee camps and who'd been victims, as their families were, of the Nakba, and who had suffered a terrible, terrible history. But I knew, there wasn't even a discussion about it. You just knew that these Palestinians were never, ever going to accept anything less than justice and freedom and self-determination. It was why, without being particularly tutored in politics in the early 90s, I became active coming back from Palestine. But I remember when the Oslo Peace Accords were being discussed, and I thought, that's just not going to fly. That is not going to fly. And it wasn't because of any sort of sophisticated understanding of politics. It's just because I'd met young Palestinians who were involved in the Intifada. And I just knew, no matter what any political leader may say, or any political narrative or media discourse might say, that was never going to fly. The Palestinians were never going to give away their right to return and to self-determination and to undo the crime of the Nakba. And that resistance will continue. It has continued, and I have no doubt it will continue until that liberation is achieved. But it can take a long time, these things. But things can also move a lot quicker than you think suddenly. History can speed up at certain moments. And the other inspiration, therefore, I would take, and I said it already, is the Irish struggle. There were very, very many dark hours. And some of the darkest hours in the Irish struggle were precisely before the dawn of the Irish Revolution, the beginning of the 20th century. I mean, we had the first modern famine in Europe, in Ireland, which was part of that genocidal colonial enterprise. I mean, that famine arose from the penal laws, which were apartheid. That's what they were. The name apartheid wasn't around, but the penal laws were a set of apartheid laws which were designed to destroy essentially the coherence of any kind of Irish national movement and to completely entrench the colonial settler regime. And despite halving the Irish population, which is what happened in 10 years. I mean, talk about bleak. The Irish population went from 8 million to 4 million in 10 years. But the resistance did not stop. And despite that bleak and harrowing trauma of oppression and colonialism, there was never any doubt but that the resistance would continue and it would eventually prevail. And I think that's true. And when I look around the world and I see the young people, new generations of young people who are thirsting for justice, for equality, for a better world to live in, I have no doubt that all of that will combine to ensure that the Palestinian struggle eventually prevails. But the more we do now, the quicker that can be.
Thanks, Richard. You also gave us even the word boycott. Huwaida, you've got the last word.
Sure. Now, I'll try to make this short because Richard and Mohanna did say it all. The inspiration does come from the Palestinian people, especially on the ground, those languishing still decades on in refugee camps and still refusing to go away, refusing to be silent. And also the fact that we are passing our stories and our struggle onto our young, the next generation, that protests are largely organized by the Palestinian youth, that my 8-year-old daughter is holding a big megaphone and chanting in the protests about justice for Palestine. So we're not going away. And if I could just leave you with one story, it's happened a while back, but it always stays with me, and it points to the kind of resilience of the Palestinian people. It was back in like 2003. I was on my way to a village of Jayus, which falls in the Qalqila region of Palestine. And we had an action going with the villagers where we were going to chain ourselves to the trees to prevent the Israeli military from uprooting them for the path of the apartheid wall. And as we were driving into the village, I saw just tons, acres of land that with trees that had already been uprooted. And I was devastated. And this was the night before the action was supposed to be the next morning. My host was making jokes, trying to make me laugh. And I said, how can you laugh at a time like this? Look at the trees on the outskirts of the village. And he said to me, Huwaida, those are my family's trees. Those are the source of our livelihood. So yes, I should be crying right now, not laughing. But that is one thing we cannot let them take away from us, Huwaida, our ability to laugh and to live. And so I keep that with me, and that keeps me hopeful.
It remains but for me to thank our three guests, Mohanna, Richard, and Huwaida. 3 excellent contributions, food for thought for our viewers to take away. And of course, the people to really thank are the viewers who've given us your time and listened to these 3 speakers. I think the lesson, you can take many lessons, but one is if you don't fight, you'll certainly lose. If you fight, you've got every chance of winning. So let's go forward and fight, friends. Thank you all and good night on behalf of the Palestine Return Centre in London.